sick people and those who were tormented by unclean spirits, and they were all healed. And so all of those that were brought to them were healed of their infirmities. And so it could have been that that did work with the shadow of Peter, but we're not told exactly. So that brings us to verse 17. I'm sorry. I usually remember, but I forgot today. They could still hear me back there. Verse 17 says, oh, actually, somebody want to read verse 17 through 21.
Then the high priest rose up, and all those who were with him, which is a sect of the Sadducees, and they were filled with indignation, and laid their hands on the apostles and put them in the common prison. But at night an angel of the Lord opened the prison doors and brought them out, and said, Go stand up in the temple, and speak to the people all the words of this life. And when they heard that, they entered the temple early in the morning and taught. But the high priest and those with him came and called the council together with all the elders and children of Israel, and sent to the prison to have them brought.
All right, so again, we have the high priest, and we're going to see it's the Sadducees. They are angry about what is being done. They just told them back in chapter 4, could have been just a few days before. We don't know exactly how much time transpired between here. But they were just told to stop preaching in the name of Christ. And what we're going to see with chapter 4, 5, and then 6 and 7, which 6 and 7 lumped together, is their anger, their frustration with the apostles grows. In chapter 4, they're upset, but they're scared of the people. They don't want them preaching. They don't like to hear this. They're scared that they're going to lose their power. So they threaten them with just verbal commands or verbal threatenings. Then chapter 5. Notice there's a key word here. Verse 17 says, and they were filled with indignation. Now that word indignation it means heat. It means jealousy. It means envy, anger. So it has a great intensity about it. This is interesting enough is the same word. Somebody read Colossians 4 and verse 13. Colossians 4 and verse 13. All right, so the word used there is zeal. That is the same word as indignation. It's the same Greek word. Somebody read Philippians 3 and verse 6, just another place it's translated that way. Philippians 3 and verse 6.
Concerning zeal, persecuting the church, concerning the righteousness which is in the law, faith, blameless. I can't talk.
It's all right. But zeal there. So we see Paul talk about zeal in Colossians 4 and how it was a great thing, and something that we should have. He talks about zeal in Philippians 3 and verse 6. What was the zeal he's focusing on there? He's talking about his zeal, but what was that zeal cause him to do? Persecute the church. He said that zeal that he had a great zeal for the for Judaism. And it caused him to persecute Christians. That's the same word here. And so it can be used in a good way to mean an intensity and a fire for God. And that's something that Paul talks about. You and I should have a fire, a desire to serve God. But on the opposite side, we see that could be used in a way of extreme anger. And that's why the word can be defined as envy. When you think of envy, what do you think of? When you envy something of someone.
It's part of jealousy.
Yeah, it's a part of jealousy. It's reaching that point of I want to do something about it. I'm envy that person. I hate them. I wish that I was that person, or I wish I was doing whatever they did. And so that intensity here. And then coupled with the word filled, right before that, said they were filled with indignation. The word filled means to be fully filled, to be overcome completely. So when we talk about anger, is anger always bad? No. Did Jesus have anger? He did. We're told to be angry and what? Sin not. This is where what it's talking about is they had anger, which that anger was back in chapter 4 too. But their anger overcame them. Their anger is starting to fester to the point where they're getting so mad at them. They're so angry at them. They want physical harm or death to come to them. And we're going to see that's exactly what they do. And then in chapter 6 and 7, when it comes to Stephen, what do they do to Stephen? Kill them. They stone him to death for it. And so why are they so angry? We've talked about this. Why are they so angry? Why is this making them so mad at what they're doing?
It's taking steam out of the Jews' sail.
Yeah, taking it out of their sail, their power, showing that Judaism is not something to be a part of anymore. The law was fulfilled, is now brought in the new. They don't want to see that. Not only that, the fear and the miraculous things that they were doing. If you think about, it says multitudes. This is many, many people being healed, many, many people seeing the power of God and hearing the message and being converted to Christ. Now you have multitudes of people leaving Judaism. What's that mean for them financially? They're going to be losing their money. They're going to be losing their influence and their power. You think about religions today, denominational religions today. We talked about this a little bit on Wednesday. What is the biggest focus with a lot of the televangelists and things like that? Money, recognition, power. So that's what we see here.
Beyond that, you talk about the money and the support. With the priests, they got their support from the people, from the sacrifices.
Yep.
That's
Yeah.
really concerned about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and think about that, the fact that that's where their meals came from was from the sacrifices that came in. They didn't have to go buy them, yeah.
It says that the high priest and then all those who were with him of that sect. And it reminds me, you get a group of people together, they're much more willing to do something evil in and of themselves than if you had them as separate individuals.
Yeah.
It just kind of feeds that envy, feeds that indignation to where a whole mob, and we see it today, a whole mob will do something that a few people or an individual won't do in and of themselves.
Yeah.
That's what they did with Jesus. They killed
Exactly.
Jesus.
Just like you said, the mob mentality, the rioting. You think about that's things that are going on today. But even in a smaller scale, you get one person angry about something, gets a bunch of other people together. It causes a lot of problems too. Instead of fixing the problem, you get a big issue.
I've seen that book a lot of times. One person will get upset at somebody, they'll get several friends, pretty soon they got a whole bunch on that one person.
Yeah.
And going after that one person.
Mhm.
So I've seen that a lot. Yeah.
That's right. And so that's what's going on here. They have, which it's the Sadducees is what's stated here. But as we're going to see, the Sanhedrin included both, included the Pharisees and the Sadducees. I know I have it in my notes. I don't know if it's right now or not. I'll just mention it. You think about this, it's interesting. Who was the leading charge to killing and putting Jesus on the cross before? High priest, but also who? Pharisees. Isn't that interesting? You have the Pharisees who wanted Jesus dead. And I'm sure Sadducees were a part of that, but what we see many times is the Pharisees, the high priests, the Pharisees, things like that. After Jesus is resurrected, what have we seen several times already? The high priests and who? Sadducees. Isn't that interesting? What do Sadducees do not like about the teaching of Christ? Resurrection. Pharisees, they were looking for a king that would take over Israel and lead them into the glories of David and Solomon. So it's just kind of interesting the focus that has been in the two with the Pharisees, and then you have the Sadducees now. But when we're looking at the Sanhedrin, it's going to include all of them. But that's what we'll see in verse 22 and on. So anyways, we see this treatment. They were angry. And what did they do? It says they laid their hands on them, verse 18, and the apostles, and put them in the common prison. You know, this treatment of God's people wasn't something new, was it? You think about Jeremiah. Jeremiah 38, verse 6 talks about the treatment of Jeremiah there. What did Jesus say in Matthew 5, verse 12? Somebody read that. Matthew 5 and verse 12. Jeremiah is just one example, but of many. Huh? Yeah, exactly. Matthew 5 and verse 12.
Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
Yeah. It's nothing new. God's people, in the prophets, they were Jews too. And yet they didn't want to hear what they had to say about their lives, and so they killed them. Then you have now where they're trying to preach the gospel, trying to preach to them that Christ has come and God's plan has been fulfilled, and you need to be a part of this church, a part of the church. And they want to kill him. It doesn't end. It continues on. And so it's nothing new for God's people during that time. And so they're thrown in prison. And then verse 19 says, "But at night an angel of the Lord opened the prison doors and brought them out and said, 'Go stand in the temple and speak to the people all the words of this life.'" And then verse 21, "And when they heard that, they entered the temple early in the morning, and it's hot. But the high priest and those that came called the council together with all the elders of Israel and sent to the prison and being brought." And so that at night, an angel of the Lord comes and opens the prison's doors, and they're brought out. And what's interesting is, where are they at? They're in prison. What was stated about this prison? It was a public prison. Was there probably other people in that prison? More than likely, right? Which is interesting when we get down to verse 22 and they come and the guards are standing there and had no clue they were gone. But an angel of the Lord comes to and tells them to, and releases them out of the prison, and tells them to go back and do exactly what they were arrested for. Not to run, not to go somewhere else, go right back to where? The temple, Solomon's porch, again, right back there and to preach. And they did. And so they were told to preach all the words of this life. What do they mean by life? What did the angel mean by life? Who is the life?
Christ.
1 John 1, one of my favorite passages, 1 through 4. John says, we have handled the word of life. He is life. And so when the angel said, go preach to the people all the words of this life, he is saying, go preach Christ. And when we preach Christ today, we are preaching life. What is that life? Not physical life. Not preaching that, hey, we're going to live for eternity in our physical body. Our souls will have an eternal home in life. Life always represents eternal glory. Death always represents, like Romans 6:23, represents an eternity in hell. And so go preach life. Go preach Christ. And so when we preach Christ, we're preaching about life. And so that's exactly what they're told to do, and they do. And so the last part of that, verse 21, when they heard this, what did they do? They were let go of the prison. They were told to go. What did they do? Got up early. That's important. They didn't just wait around and we'll wait a little bit. No, they got up early to do what God wanted them to do. And they went right back to where they were arrested. And so the high priest gathers the council back together. Now this is the Sanhedrin, or calls the council together. And their purpose was to try them. And their purpose was to go to the prison and find them. So now we'll go down to verse 22. Somebody read verse 22 through 26, please.
But when the officers came and did not find them in the prison, they returned and reported, saying, "Indeed, we found the prison shut securely and the guards standing outside before the doors. But when we opened them, we found no one inside." Now when the high priest, the captain of the temple, and the chief priests heard these things, they wondered what the outcome would be. So one came and told them, saying, "Look, the men whom you put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people." Then the captain went with the officers and brought them without violence, for they feared the people, lest they should be stoned.
Yep, that's it. All right, so what surprise it would have been for them to go and find. Not only were they not there, the guards were standing outside, at attention, whatever the case may be, guarding the jail, and had no clue. And not only that, if this was a common prison and there was other people there, did they not know? Because if they had woke up, or whatever the case may be, and said, "What happened?" or if they had saw the angel come and take them out, they would have been saying, "I want to get out too." And that would have alerted the guards, right? Because it's going to be an uproar. How did they get out and we not? We're not. We're still here. And so they were surprised too. And so you think about that surprise that's there. And, we talk about it's not just one person. This is the apostles. This is all 12 of them. From my understanding from the context, it was the apostles that were thrown in prison. And so verse 24, they go and they report about what they had found. They found that the temple was empty, and when the chief priests heard these things, they wondered what the outcome would be. James Fawcett and Brown, which is a commentator, stated this, that the Sanhedrin sat in a chamber at the south end of the temple, while Solomon's porch, where Peter appears to have spoken unto the people all the words of this life, was in another direction. So it's interesting. The Sanhedrin met in one area of the temple, and the apostles were meeting in another area, and they didn't even know each other were there. The Sanhedrin had no clue that they were just on the other side, or whatever case may be, whatever direction of the temple they were at. So that's interesting. They didn't know what was going on. And so they were at a loss at what had happened. And I think that's interesting. They wondered what the outcome would be. They were at a loss of what had happened. Think about that a minute. What had the apostles been doing for days, for weeks, for years? I mean, not years, but for weeks. Preaching, teaching. Not only that, they were doing miraculous things. To me, it would have easily said, you know what? Something miraculous happened here. There's no way they could have got out of the jail without anybody knowing. What does that show about their minds, their hearts? The Sanhedrin here. They're questioning it.
Well, you think about when Peter and John were arrested for healing one person.
Mm-hmm.
And they told him, "Don't do this anymore." Well, here we got the same people in charge, upset because a lot of stuff's happening, all miracles that are happening. And they said, "Okay, we're going to take care of this." They think, well, we're going to be more severe. And just imagine, they're like, well, we got to round up the whole gang, put them in prison, and we're going to show them. And can you imagine the embarrassment they had when they were saying, "Hey, the prison's empty and we don't know anything about it." Those of us who were watching it, we don't know what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to make people question what's going on. Because you go back to, remember the one who said, was it Gamaliel that said, "If this is a God, you can't not overcome it."
Yeah, that's the rest of this, yeah.
Yeah, then it will fail.
Yep, exactly. You think about it, when I look at this, and I look, you mentioned the man that was healed. This is what started all this back in chapter 3. They did not run to recognize where that power came from, which was from God. Here again, all of these miraculous things are happening. They still don't want to recognize it's from God. Then we get to the Sanhedrin, this meeting here in a minute. They still didn't want to recognize it was from God. What does that say about their hearts? They're hardened. That just shows you how hardened someone's heart can get, to where so obvious of a thing in front of their face, and they still don't see it because they don't want to. They don't care. Huh?
Pharaoh in the plains.
Yeah, Pharaoh in the plains is another great example. So much in his face, and yet he still just didn't want to believe it.
Well, and you talk about the wicked people who persecuted the good people. You saw that in Noah's day, when it goes all the way back to the beginning. Noah preached to the people to try to get them to repent, to change. And they weren't going to have any of it. They ridiculed and mocked him. Abel did what was right. Cain didn't do what was right. And it was right there in front of his face. And God says, you know, why is your countenance fallen? You know, just do what's right and you'll be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And Cain had it right there in front of his face. He went and killed his brother.
Yeah.
So we have that today. It will continue as long as time continues. We want to teach what's right, but some people who have evil in their hearts or wickedness in their heart aren't going to accept it.
Yeah.
They're going to answer.
Exactly. You know, Paul talks about it in Romans chapter 1. The progression, the hardening their heart. They first reject God, and they turn themselves over to vain and terrible things. And they have their hearts hardened. And then Paul talks about it again. I think it's in 1 Thessalonians 4 or 1 Thessalonians 5. That same hardening there. It was like that from the beginning, and it's going to continue today. And so you think about when you sit down to talk to someone, you may have shown them the truth many times over, and they still don't want to see it. So that can happen. Or someone that has left the church, someone that has left the faith, 2 Peter 2. And that same thing, they have hardened their hearts to the truth. They don't want to come back.
And you said from 1 John, his writings there in chapter 3, verse 10 says, in this the children of God are manifest, and the children of the devil. Whosoever doeth not righteousness is not of God, neither is he that loveth not his brother.
Yep.
So he who loves his brother and does righteous things in God's judgment is proved by God. He who doesn't love his brother and doesn't do righteous things is of the devil.
Yeah. And it says later on, he that doth righteousness is righteous. And so, yeah. And so it's easily people can get their hearts hardened. Even the Sanhedrin here, where it's right in their face, they're seeing people that could not walk get up and walk. All of these miraculous things happen, and they still did not want to believe that this was from God, except for one person, which I don't even, you think about Gamaliel saying what he did. Did he really believe that that's connecting the dots here, that this movement was from God? But he used some logic there. He used some reasoning with them, saying, if this is, it's not going to go away. Now, we don't know about later on for Gamaliel. In history, it states that his son ended up serving in the same capacity as Gamaliel up till Jerusalem was destroyed. So maybe, according to history, he didn't ever convert over to Christianity, but we don't know that for sure. That's just what history tells us. But it's just interesting what we see here. Okay, so what do we get down to? Verse 25. And so, verse 25, so one came and told him, saying, look, the men whom you put in prison are standing in the temple and preaching to the people. Notice the exclamation there. We read it and we're just reading it. But they're like, I can't believe what's going on. They're over there. They're just right over there preaching what you and doing exactly what you told them not to do and what you arrested them for. And so, verse 26, the captain went with the officers and brought them without violence, for they feared the people lest they should be stoned. Now, that's important. The apostles came without violence. What does that tell you about the apostles? They weren't afraid. I think that's a big part of it. They weren't afraid of what was going to happen to them. They didn't care what would happen to them because they knew they were doing God's will. Another thing is that they respected the authority of the Sanhedrin. Think about that. Because they were arrested, they were called to go and stand before the Sanhedrin. I think they were still showing a sign of respect because they were leaders at that time, and they were told to go stand before them. Instead of fighting, they would do that. But also, we see that the people that came to them to drag them to the Sanhedrin, were scared of the people, and they didn't want to cause a riot or cause problems.
Would have shown violence, fighting. It would have provoked the multitude to also get in on the fight.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. That mob mentality can work in that direction too.
The fact that they went quietly, then the public, let it fall into place.
Yeah.
So I read this totally different than you. I read this that they brought them carefully because had the mob not been there, they probably would have been dragging them by their hair back to the jail. They
Yeah.
were angry. So instead they were just like, get your butt over there. Like you do when you're a parent. But that's how I read that. It's like the guards were the ones who were like, okay, we got to take this real easy.
I think you're right. I think there's both sides of it. They recognized that it could have been really bad for them, the Sanhedrin.
I would imagine the apostles
But
would have
with the apostles having all the people around, like Kathy said, they could have easily said, no, we're not going.
been rebuked them.
And the people there could have helped to keep them from being arrested.
Well, Jesus was going
And so,
across because of the law.
yeah.
Like all they say, the apostles may not be put to death because of the law.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to see they did not do any more than beat them later because they were scared of the people. I think they wanted them to die. Ultimately, I think they wanted them to be put to death for what they were doing. And so I can see where both can be. I think they had some respect for the authorities at that time, and they showed that. But they also
They had to conduct themselves
had,
without reproach.
yeah, they did.
There wasn't a choice for them to misbehave.
Yeah, just like what Paul said, in Romans chapter 14. Respect the powers that be because God put them there. And it talks about kings, those in high authority, even the magistrates, those that are sent out by them to show that respect. Then you have, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1 and 2. Paul tells them to pray for those that are in authority, like Nero, who was trying to kill them. And so I think that they're showing the people, they have an example here. They're showing the people how they are to act, even in the time of oppression or time of persecution that they're dealing with.
If you think about it, they did exactly what Jesus did.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Jesus went with them when he was crucified. I mean, Peter stood up and was ready to fight, and Jesus was like, no, that's, and so, I mean, they
Yeah.
have the example, and they're following the example they had.
That's a good point. They saw the example of Christ, and they're following that same example. That's a good point. That's right.
And it's still an example today because, like, whenever we hear the men praying, they pray for the leaders of our country, whether or not we agree with them or not.
Yeah, that's right.
But they're also being told by the ones in authority over them, stop doing this stuff, and they're getting told by God and angels, go do this.
And so that's where the difference is of Romans 14 and the respect there. There's laws, there's their imposition, that we are to respect them. But when it gets to that point where it goes beyond and over what God says and goes against what God says, that's where it changes. And yeah, we're going to see that. They say we ought to obey God rather than men. And so there is a line. There's definitely a line.
Think about that. These guys were just arrested the day before from prison. They thought, hey, it turned out all right, so we'll just go with them.
Yeah.
God has his own voice this time.
Yeah.
They were last night.
Yeah. It's an adventure, right? No. Yeah, I mean, they
knew God was on their side.
They knew God was on their side. What did God tell them in Acts 2, or Acts chapter 1, verse 8? Go into all the world, and that's the Great Commission, but part of that, it says, you'll be witnesses unto me in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the rest of the world. So they had a purpose, and their purpose was to get the gospel to the world. And they knew God was going to be with them. God told them that. Jesus told them that in Mark 16, 16 and following, 17 and following. And so,
The book of Acts is the same thing over and over again. About the time that they start hurting a lot of people start listening, then somebody's ready to prosecute them or
Yeah.
kill them, and they move on to the next. And it just goes all the way through the Bible. I mean,
the book of Acts that way, yeah.
that way.
Yeah. And God was with them through that whole time. And then there was a point where they all died. And, God protected them, and God took care of them until the purpose that they needed was done. And then all of them died tragic deaths. And so they say John possibly was not only one, I think it was John, but history tells us he was burned in tar and suffered and was isolated on Patmos for it. And then died later, old death.
I'm amused by their rescue from prison when an angel of the Lord comes and opens up the prison doors and says, go preach this life, go preach about the resurrection and about Jesus. Then they end up showing up before the Sadducees. What do the Sadducees not believe in? They don't believe in angels. They don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe in spirits. So they were confused how they got out of prison anyway.
Yeah.
And if the apostles had explained how they got out of prison, Sadducees wouldn't have understood it.
No, they wouldn't have. Which, that goes right back to chapter 4. They weren't in prison, but when they put in front of them and they were told, do not be preaching about, this, they go right to the resurrection about Christ. Yeah. And so, because that is life. That's what 1 Corinthians 15, basically the whole chapter. Life is, if there wasn't a resurrection, we wouldn't have life. So, yeah. I didn't think about the angels part, but that's interesting. Yeah.
They had to have known people that had been lame or evil spirits and this and that, so they had to have known some of those people that they knew.
Yeah. Surely they did.
Harden their hearts to.
Yeah. Just like the man that sat in the gate of the temple in chapter 4 or chapter 3. They walked by him every day. They knew it. And so they couldn't deny it. So that's right. It's so many facts and so many things right in their face, yet they still let money, power, position like that get in the way of what the truth was. And that was different than today. People will sacrifice, even individually. We talk about the people that are out there preaching, but individually people will sacrifice their spirituality, their Christianity, to money, position, things like that in life. So, no different. So, yeah, good point. All right, so we get down to verse 26. And so they were brought without violence, for they feared the people, and they would be stoned. And so then verse 27 and 28 says, when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, did we not strictly command you to not teach in this name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring this man's blood on us. I think that's interesting. You guys still have notes on this? Guys, are we still on the same? I know I need to print off some more. I don't know if we got to that point yet or not. Yeah. Okay, so 27 and 28, they tell them, didn't we just threaten you and tell you not to do this? And you did not listen. And so notice that they stated they did not want Christ's name preached. Now, did they say Christ? No, they said, we don't want you to preach in this man's name. They did, but notice the reasons why they didn't want Jesus' name preached. That's the end of verse 28. Look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring this man's blood on us. That's interesting. They didn't want Jesus' name preached because they did not want his blood on their hands. Somebody go and read Matthew 27:25.
How many do not bow their knee to Baal?
And all the people answered and said, His blood be on us and on our children.
What did they say there? I would about guarantee, because the high priest was a part of that, the mob was a part of this. They were the ones inciting, trying to get the mob to do this. They were there when Jesus was crucified. Maybe not all of them, but I would say a good part of them. What did they say there? Let his blood be upon us and our children forever. Then you get to now, and they're like, wait a second, we don't want this man's blood on us. You're out here telling people that it was us that put him on the cross. I don't want that on my name.
So it'd be the rulers?
Yeah.
Saying,
Yep. And so it's a lie. They wanted it to happen, and when it did happen, now they're like, wait a second, no, don't be doing this. Don't put this on us. They didn't want the name of Christ to be known as also as innocent. They didn't want to, because if they recognized that Christ was the Messiah, they would have to recognize they falsely accused him, they falsely imprisoned him, they falsely killed him, or an innocent man. They didn't want that on their conscience. They did not want to think about that. They didn't want any thought of that, because that would put them in the position of Acts 2 and verse 37. Men and brethren, what shall we do?
In the beginning, they probably, when they were saying, let it be on us, they didn't think that he was the Messiah. And then now they're going, ooh, he's the Messiah.
He wasn't.
I don't want this on me.
Exactly. That's right. They didn't want to see that he was, and now there's so much proof they can't deny it, and now they don't want it to be charged with it, for sure.
Because, well, I guess they haven't, Paul's not Paul yet, but he's guilty of the same things.
Mhm.
His life was so much different.
Yeah, that's right.
I was just thinking about, for example, politics today. Politicians will say something and get people worked up about it. Action gets taken, and then down the road, repercussions come from that, and politicians like, no, I didn't say that.
Yeah. They want what they want, but they don't want the consequences. And that's no different than any, many people are like that.
And they depend on everybody to forget.
Yeah. You know, it's something we talk about in the jail. There's consequences for everything. Good consequences, bad consequences. And we have to make the choice on, you know, when we make a choice, we have to make sure we're ready for the consequence. And they made the choice. They wanted him dead, but they didn't want the consequence of it. And so we see that here.
Their mindset's still the same today, the Jews, because that movie, the Passion,
Mm-hmm.
it's in there that his blood be upon us, in the movie, and the Jews did not want that stated in the movie. Even to this day, 2,000 years later, they're still not wanting to take the money
Yeah.
for putting Jesus on the cross.
And they said forever. They wanted it. I mean, it's crazy to think how, like I said, how quickly it changed. And so, all right, we're out of time. Any questions or comments on anything?